It's never easy to do a memorial broadcast for someone who's well known, but it's even more difficult to do it when it's somebody who has been a friend and a colleague. Welcome to Skywatch TV, a special broadcast for Tuesday, March 7th, 2017. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me in studio, the CEO of Skywatch TV, Tom Horn.
Derek. And
our COO, Joe Ardishorn.
Hi, Derek.
And as you probably know by now, the gentleman we're talking about is our friend and colleague who has gone home to be with the Lord, Cris Putnam. We found out about this last week, and the wishes of the family, we held off on revealing it or disclosing the information until the weekend when his family posted it publicly to Facebook. And, of course, the response through the community on Facebook was overwhelming. And, it's difficult to know what to say. I guess, just in terms of nuts and bolts, we can pass along just the highlights of his time with us here at Skywatch, the time that we knew him, and just some basic information regarding the memorial service, which is scheduled for tomorrow in Raleigh, North Carolina, Providence Baptist Church. But other than that, this just came as a real shock. Last Wednesday evening, apparently, in his sleep, Cris was called home.
Yeah, in fact, if it had not been that it was Shelley, his wife, that had texted Nita and said that he had passed away in his sleep, I would have found it very difficult to believe. My brain still had a hard time kind of wrapping around this idea that Cris Putnam was gone, because he wasn't very old, 51 years of age. And we knew that he was, dealing a little bit maybe with some kind of illness. We weren't sure exactly what it was. We had speculated a little bit about it. And I know he'd been in to see the doctors a few times over the last few years, but nothing definitive. And so it just came as a real surprise. In fact, we're getting a lot of email, people wanting to know what he died of, and this is just something we don't know yet. Yeah. It's probably some kind of heart failure, but why and what that led to. As I understand it, they have done an autopsy. So at some point there will be a coroner's report, and maybe there'll be more information available as to exactly why. But it reminds us that life is a vapor, right? Yes. And that what we do, we have to do quickly. And one thing you could say about Cris Putnam, he kind of came on the scene like a fire just 4 or 5 years ago. And in that short period of time, accomplished a lot more than a lot of people will in their lifetime. Yes. In terms of producing solid theology. Cris was an apologist. He was great at arguing his point, right? And I still remember one day, him and I were talking, and I said, well, that happened during the Council of Trent, saying something about one of the books of the Bible that was expunged from the canon, right? And he said, oh, no, it wasn't. And he went into this big, long historical thing, and I said, well, thank you. I'm glad to be set straight, right? So he had a fabulous mind, and of course he was a student. He was a bronze medallion holder from Chuck Missler's Koinonia Institute. Right. Mm-hmm. He had earned his degree from Liberty University. He had a master's degree from Liberty, but he had also done quite a bit of research into Mike Heiser's teaching and what does it call it, the Naked Bible, and so he had a very inquisitive mind. A lot of people out there may not know, that Cris and I, we really didn't even know each other till about 5 years ago. And Joe and I were at a prophecy conference, and we were talking about why hasn't anybody written, a book on the final pope? Because this prophecy, whenever, Benedict XVI either dies or steps down, we're going to hit Pope number 112, right? So we were talking about it, and we decided that this was a book that Defender Publishing ought to investigate. So why am I telling this story with Cris? Because Cris and I had never met face-to-face. I was only vaguely familiar with his Logos Apologia, blog site where he talked about theology. And so I go up to my hotel room to email myself some of the talking points that Joe and I had come up with, and I had an email from out of the blue from this guy named Cris Putnam, right? And he was wanting to know if he could quote something that I had written in 2009, the only paragraph I ever wrote about the prophecy of the popes, and he wanted to know if he could quote it, right? And so I emailed him back, and I said, Cris, you can't believe the timing of your email. Well, it turns out It was very providential. It was preternatural. I mean, as time went on, we looked back at that so often and realized that God had brought him and I together for a moment in time to write, well, this book, Petrus Romanus, right? That was Chris's first book that he did with me. The second one's kind of got a funny story around it. Exo Vaticana.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, Chuck Misler said of this book, he said, this is the best book ever written on the subject with the worst title.
Right.
He hated that title. But it's a pretty interesting story around that, isn't there? I mean, when we went up to Mount Graham.
Oh, yeah. So what a lot of people may not have known about Cris, except given the opportunity that I had from time to time over the last 5 years, getting to see Cris wasn't so unusual for folks if it's in the environment of a documentary movie or he's on the History Channel, a channel in Canada, et cetera. But he had a really funny sense of humor that would come out on the road. And one of my favorite memories of Cris was Tom and I were driving with Cris up to Mount Graham. And we were talking about these documentary films that are made where somebody will kind of rush into an area where it's authorized personnel only, just so they can film being escorted out by, security or whatever, so that they can put it in their movie as, see, we knew they were hiding something all along. Well,
right.
Any clown could do that anywhere where there's security and get it on film and make it look like something's being hidden. But anyway, we're on our way up to Mount Graham, and Cris was joking about how the three of us should just rush anything that looks like security, yelling, "We're here to see the aliens!" But another fun thing about Cris was, and Donna Howell, she talked about this repeatedly. Cris had this thing where people that saw him thought he looked just like Christopher Reeve from the Superman movies.
Right.
So he had this kind of internet, Facebook kind of legendary nickname tag, Superman. Mm-hmm. And it was so obvious to so many people. We'll post a couple of these, but he even had fan art.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
People digitally Photoshop him on Superman's body. And one guy, and I have no idea who this individual is, but if you just Google Cris Putnam Superman, there's fan art where somebody has taken colored pencils even and artistically displayed him with a great big C where the normal S would go as Superman.
Right.
So, for those that didn't get to see that side of Cris, it's a tragedy. But man, we did a lot of laughing, didn't we, Tom?
Oh, we did. He, like you say, he had a great sense of humor. We were cracking up all the time, right? Mm-hmm. But what the public mostly saw was this more serious side to him, because he was very effective in arguing either a historical point or a theological point. And but there was this other side, and so it was. We're going to miss, being able to have those kind of times with Cris Putnam. And you mentioned that he was on the History Channel. He was also here in the United States on the History Channel in one of the programs where they're talking about the prophecies of Nostradamus. But they had Cris on there talking about biblical prophecy, and it was one of those rare moments where the History Channel didn't, tweak it to try to make a Christian look dumb. He came across very intelligent. He was in a couple of, there was a documentary made out of Canada that him and I were both in. He was in the Last Pope movie that was produced by WorldNet Daily.
Joseph
spoke at a lot of conferences, gave lectures, was on Sid Roth's It's Supernatural, was on the Jim Baker Show, and on those more than once. Prophecy Watchers, Prophecy in the News, Skywatch Television. So within a 5-year period of time, Cris Putnam accomplished an awful lot that will live on undoubtedly, throughout time, to continue ministering to people those timeless truths.
Yeah. The first time I met him was actually 7 years ago, and almost 7 years ago exactly. It was April of 2010. There was a conference in Nashville called the Last Days Conference. L.A. Marzulli was there, Russ Dizdar, Chris Pinto, Dr. Michael Bennett, a number of other people that folks would be familiar with. And Chris and Shelley were there as attendees. This was the first conference that they had ever attended of that type. And he told me a bit about his backstory and his history as an aspiring rock and roll guitarist, which, Joe, you know a little something about, and how that lifestyle was not conducive to living long or living in a way that would be pleasing to the one who created us. And it is remarkable that he turned from that path to being a legitimate scholar of the Bible. His book, The Supernatural Worldview, is one that I think is an important work that everybody should have. You should have this on your reference shelf.
Yeah.
If no other work by Cris, that book should be on your reference shelf, because it documents how the academic world is recognizing that there are things that happen in our world that cannot be explained by natural means.
Right.
And I consider it a high honor that he consented to allow me to contribute a chapter to your final book, The Final Roman Emperor.
Right.
And the last interview we did for my personal podcast, I consider to be one of the best interviews, just in terms of the information that was pulled out in the span of an hour that I've ever been privileged to be a part of. So,
yeah. And in this book, you mentioned the supernatural worldview. He authored this by himself. It was his idea for a book. And I, too, have agreed that this is one of the more important books that's been published by anybody, actually, in the last decade. And the part in there that was very interesting to me was when he was talking about Watchman Nee and some of the stuff that Watchman Nee had written about the latent power of the soul or of the mind, and how Cris was concerned that as we moved closer to the end times, more psychic-type phenomena could increase, and the role that could play as being connected to prophecy. But he tells a story in there. I can't remember the name of this story, but it was featured like on Unsolved Mysteries, where people kept seeing this ghostly figure of a woman on a road, remember?
Yes.
Yeah.
And she kept trying to flag people down. Some people would stop, and then she would be gone. The police department kept getting calls. There's a nude woman. She's up on the side of the road, right?
Right.
Turns out that this woman had run off the road down into this canyon. She was dead, actually.
Right.
And her young son was in the vehicle, alive. And finally, at one point, the young son comes all the way up to the road. He climbs up the side of this mountain. There's nobody there. He goes back down. But the storyline was, was this her angel, or was this a ghost, or something like that? But if a person reads his story in here, the part they will also learn is how Cris tracked down this young boy, who now, of course, is an adult,
Right.
and Cris led him to the Lord, right?
Yeah.
And so it was just a very, very cool story, and we believed in it. Of course, you mentioned his final book, The Final Roman Emperor. That was his idea for a book. This one that we did together, On the Path of the Immortals, that took us about 2 years ago now. Cris went into Sedona. And again, I don't know if it was just the Lord blessing Cris, or if he's a right place, right time kind of a guy. I don't know what it was. But he went there, and while he was there, he set up 2 camera angles because he was trying to find, is there really any photographic evidence of what people are saying there about a doorway or a portal and something coming in and out of it. And from 2 camera angles, he filmed this orb-like thing that came through this gateway, this doorway, this Stargate or whatever, fluttered around above their heads, and then literally just dissipated like gas. But we have that on film. But while he was also there, Shelley, I think, his wife, was snapping pictures of him. And they didn't know till later, when they got the proofs of the images, that he had caught the giant V-shaped Phoenix Light type craft, gigantic, and you could see it in terms of its proportion because there's a great big tree on the ground that gave it distance and size, huge V-shaped craft. So anyway, you mentioned music. One other thing we should tell people is that Cris was a gifted guitarist.
Yeah, he
had quite a collection of guitars and stuff too, didn't he?
Yeah, he had a handful, and I remember one time we were at a hotel and he was introducing his music to me for the first time, and I was kind of blown away. And it was this whole other side where he could have done it professionally. And at one point when he was young, that was a goal of his. It was like his dream, but he surrendered it because he felt like the Lord was calling him to write. But and I think there are still YouTube videos. I'm not sure how easy they are to find, but he had done some very Satriani-ish guitar instrumental pieces over ambient music, and the whole experience was kind of different than what I was used to. And I thought, and I asked him, I said, "Wow, man, you could have really made a run at doing that." And he said, "Well, when I was young, I did, but the Lord had different plans for me."
Yeah, he did use his music in his church too. He was part of the worship team for quite some time. So yeah, that was another part of him. So
Yeah. Well, again, the funeral services are scheduled for tomorrow, that being Wednesday, March the 8th of 2017, at Providence Baptist Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. We don't have any more information than that as far as times or the directions or anything of that nature. But you do a search on the web, you can find that without too much difficulty. Our prayers are with Shelley and with the Putnam family, because this is unexpected. Again, especially when you're dealing with somebody who you've known or worked with, someone who's younger than you. It just kind of reminds us all of our own mortality, and that none of us is guaranteed yet another day. So all of us at Skywatch TV wishing a fond farewell too soon until the day that we're reunited in the new kingdom. Cris Putnam, gone at the age of 51. We thank you for watching. This is Skywatch TV.